Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Hafner and I'm one of your attorneys at the League of Oregon Cities. We're going to go and talk about ethics and understanding your legal obligations. Our goals today are to learn about the ethics law, learn who's in charge, learn about the jurisdiction of those in charge, and we're going to cover a couple topics such as gifts, prohibited use of office, conflicts of interest, nepotism, outside employment, and your annual verified statement of economic interest. Most importantly, we're also going to try to help you learn how to stay out of trouble. Today's focus is going to be on the Oregon government ethics laws. So a lot of times I'll get a member inquiry saying, hey Jamie, someone on the council was kind of doing some behavior and it was a little shady. I think there's something wrong happening there. What do you think? And I think it's really important to note the Oregon government ethics law only cares about two things. It cares about the laws in the Oregon Revised Statute, Chapter 244, and Administrative Rule, Chapter 199. We have to remember public officials legally don't have to be nice, they don't have to be kind, and sometimes they might do things that, I don't agree with either, but as long as they are not outside the ethics laws, then there's no jurisdiction for the commission. So the ethics laws apply to all public officials in Oregon. So we have to know who is a public official. A public official is any person serving the state of Oregon or any of its political subdivisions or any other public body as an elected official, appointed official, employee, or agent, irrespective of whether the person is compensated for the service. So the too long, didn't read version of that, if you're a city official, staff member, employee, or volunteer, you are most likely going to be a public official. So who's in charge? The Oregon Government Ethics Commission is in charge of administering the ethics laws. They review and investigate any reports of any sort of violation. They will produce some sort of resolution, whether that is just a reprimand or a full-on contested case process. And most importantly, the commission and its staff provides advice. So I have a link on the screen there, and that's going to take you to prior advice, which is very helpful to kind of know what the commission has stated in the past. But it's also important to know that you can actually go and call the commission and ask for advice on a matter, and you can rely on that advice for determining how to proceed next. So let's talk about what's not under the jurisdiction of the Government Ethics Commission. So as I mentioned earlier, demeanor, misinformation, financial management, campaign finance, and your moral compass. So again, as we look up to our elected officials and city leaders, we would like for them to always be courteous and always be nice. But quite frankly, that's just not something that's subject to the state ethics laws. The first area we're going to talk about are gifts and what you are allowed and what you're not allowed to receive as a public official. So what's a gift? A gift is something of economic value given to a public official, a candidate, or a relative or member of the household of that public official or candidate, without valuable consideration of equivalent value, including the full or partial forgiveness of indebtedness, which is not extended to others on the same terms and conditions, or for valuable consideration less than required from others who are not public officials or candidates. So again, what does that actually mean? It means if you received an item or discount that wasn't available to members of the general public under the same terms and conditions, it's probably a gift. Because we talked about how these gift provisions might apply to something your relative received, who is considered a relative under the ethics laws? There are some obvious ones, such as your spouse, your children or children-in-laws, your parents, step-parents, siblings, step-siblings, and the same members of your in-laws. So for example, your spouse's child, your spouse's parent, etc. Anyone from whom the public official has a legal support obligation. So you might have somebody who is not a blood relative, but you have a legal reason to provide support for them. Anyone receiving the benefits of the public official's public employment, and anyone from whom the candidate receives benefits arising from that individual's employment. So if you receive a gift, what are some of the limitations? Well, a public official, relative, or household member may not solicit or receive any gift with a value exceeding $50 from any single source and reasonably known to have a legislative or administrative interest. Let's talk about what it means to have a legislative or administrative interest. A legislative or administrative interest is defined as an economic interest distinct from that of the general public in any matter subject to the decision or vote of the public official acting in their official capacity, or any matter that would be subject to the decision or vote of a candidate who, if elected, would become a public official. So I think it's pretty easy to tell a lot of times for elected officials when a decision that they make is subject to a vote or decision. For those staff members who are sitting in on the presentation today, sometimes it can be a little more tricky. So a lot of times, other decisions include things such as if you're the staff person in charge of approving a contract, or you're an enforcement officer and you're deciding whether or not to issue a citation. All these things are examples of a legislative or administrative interest that a person of the public could have in your decisions or votes. I'm now going to go through actually a long list of items that are not considered gifts. So if any of these things which are not considered gifts, you receive them, there are no limitations on the amount that you can receive. For example, gifts from relatives or household members. So as much as your relatives and your close loved ones have really enjoyed sitting on the campaign trail with you, you can go home tonight and tell them they can still provide you with gifts. Admission provided to or the cost of food and beverage consumed by the public official, relative, household member, or staff member accompanying the official at a reception, meal, or meeting while representing the city. So for example, if you're representing the city at a reception, the cost of admission and food consumed is not considered a gift. You can receive those items without any concern. Reasonable food, travel, or lodging expenses providing to a public official, relative, household member, or staff member of a public official accompanying them while representing the city on an officially sanctioned trade promotion or fact-finding mission or in officially designated negotiations or economic development activities where the receipt of these expenses was approved in advance. So when you're representing the city, again, the cost of admission and the food is not considered a gift. In addition, if you're asked to travel on behalf of your city in your official capacity, let's say you want to share your city's experience while handling a homeless issue in your city, and you're traveling to kind of tell them, other officials, how your city handled those items, those expenses that are approved in advance are not considered gifts. Food or beverage consumed by the public official or a candidate at a reception where food or beverage is provided and is incidental to the reception. No cost is placed on the food and beverage. So you go to some sort of city gathering, maybe even it's a Chamber of Commerce meeting and there's cookies and coffee in the back. You can eat those cookies, you can drink that coffee and not have to worry about reporting that gift. Entertainment provided to the public official, candidate or relative or household member that is incidental to the main purpose of the event. Let's say you go to some sort of conference and there is live music playing in the background. You didn't attend the conference solely for the live music, so that live music is something that is not considered a gift. Entertainment provided to the public official, relative, or household member, where the public official is acting in an official capacity while representing the city for a ceremonial purpose. Let's say you're the mayor of a city who has a minor league baseball team, and you are going to throw the first opening pitch. So your free admission to that baseball game and where you acted in your official capacity representing the city, those tickets are not considered a gift. Reasonable expenses paid by a unit of government, a membership organization in which the public body pays membership dues, or a not-for-profit 5013C corporation for attendance at a convention, fact-finding mission, trip, conference, or other meeting if the public official is delivering a speech, making a presentation, participating on a panel, or representing the city. For example, at the League's annual conference, We've graciously asked you to please present on a panel in your area of expertise. If we pay for your travel and mileage, that is not considered a gift. Expenses provided by one public official to another for travel inside Oregon to or from an event that bears a relationship to the receiving official's office and at which the official participates in an official capacity. Let's say the mayor of a neighboring town, or maybe even a town outside your region, invites you to learn about their new aquatic center. And your city is also thinking about implementing an aquatic center or recreation center. If the inviting city agrees to pay for your expenses to take that trip, that's not considered a gift. Informational or program material, publications, or subscriptions related to the recipient's performance of official duties. Now, as much as you all love receiving informational material from the League and any sort of publications and subscriptions related to the League, those are not gifts. I apologize. Waiver or discount of registration expenses or materials provided at a continuing education event that the public official or candidate may attend to satisfy a professional licensing requirement. So for example, as an attorney for the League, I'm required to maintain my professional license, and oftentimes that requires me to attend various learning events and opportunities, and a lot of times there are reduced government attorney rates. I can receive that reduced rate of admission as not as a gift. Unsolicited tokens or awards in the form of a plaque, trophy, desk item, wall memento, or similar item with a resale value reasonably expected to be less than $25. So for example, you've worked for the city for 30 years and they provide you with a plaque that says, "Thank you, Jamie Hafner, for your 30 years of service with the city." Now there is one caveat to this one. If that plaque is made of pure gold or any other type of valuable material, and that material can be, say, for example, sold separately with a higher value, then that would be considered something with a resale value more than $25, and that would be considered a gift. Anything of economic value offered, solicited, or received by the public official, candidate, relative, or household member as part of the usual and customary practice, or the official's private capacity that bears no relationship to the public official or candidate's official position or public office. So for example, in your private life, let's say you're an accountant and you've worked at you're retiring from your accounting firm and they provide you with a nice watch. So long as they don't say, "Here's your nice watch, please think about us at your next council meeting," you're probably in the clear to accept that item. And finally, contributions to a legal expense trust fund established for the benefit of the public official. If you find yourself subject to an ethics investigation, please feel free to solicit as much money as you would like into your legal expense trust fund. So I want to state this is not an exclusive list of all items that are not considered gifts. They are just the more common ones that city public officials face. For a complete list, please refer back to Oregon Revised Statutes, Chapter 244. So here are a couple things that you should ask yourself before accepting a gift. One, is it a gift within the definition under ORS 244.020? Again, are you being offered this item on the same terms as the general public, or is it something that's kind of specific to your position as a public official? Step 2, do any of the exceptions that I just listed apply? Remember, if any of the items that you receive fall within the exceptions that I just listed, it is not considered a gift. Number 3, does the source have a legislative or administrative interest in my position? Said in other words, does the gifter have any sort of interest in my decisions that I make as a public official? And finally, is the value greater than $50? I can receive any items from anybody over the course of a year so long as it's under $50, but I have to be careful and make sure I do not receive anything greater than $50. So let's flush through the gifts provisions with a couple of hypotheticals. A mayor's residence recently suffered property damage due to flooding. Members of the public have set up a donation drive for the mayor. May the mayor accept the donations? Well, let's run through the steps. Number 1, is the item being received, in this case the donations, something that is offered to the general public on the same terms and conditions? Well, no. In this case, the donations are specifically targeted for the mayor. Step 2, do any of the exceptions apply? Well, no, they don't. I'll just tell you that right now. Step 3, does the source have a legislative or administrative interest in the decisions of the mayor? Well, in this case, we really don't know. So what we'll have to do is that we'll have to keep track of who the specific individual donors are. Because as a matter of speaking, generally, every citizen in your city is considered to have a legislative or administrative interest in your decisions as either a councilor or the mayor. So assuming there are some people who have a legislative or administrative interest, the mayor may only accept donations up to $50 from those individuals. If there are donors who do not have a legislative or administrative interest in the mayor's decisions, then he may accept any amount in donations at any amount. Let's look at another question. A nationwide cell phone carrier is offering free cell service to first responders for 10 years. The promotion will only be available to active duty first responders in certain positions within state, local, or tribal government public safety agencies which contract agency-wide with the carrier. May a city firefighter take advantage of the promotion? Well, let's run through the steps. Step 1, is the item being offered to the general public on the same terms and conditions as the firefighter? Well, in this case, the hypothetical specifically states that the promotion is only available to active duty first responders in government, so no. Step 2, do any of the exceptions apply? No. Step 3, is there a legislative or administrative interest? It depends in this case. If the city firefighter is the decision maker in the agency's contract with cell phone carriers, then yes, possibly there may be a legislative and administrative interest. And if there is a legislative or administrative interest, then I'm assuming the 10-year cell phone service and each year is going to be worth more than $50. So if the city firefighter is in charge of the contracts with the agency, then no, he may not accept it. If the city firefighter has absolutely no say in who the department contracts with for cell phone service, then yes, he may accept it. And our last hypothetical. You are a city staff member and it's your manager's birthday. The two of you have known each other for years and are close friends. You decide to purchase a nice birthday present. May your manager accept? Well, let's go through the steps again. Step 1, is the item offered to others on the same terms and conditions? In this case, no, the item is only being offered to your city manager. Step 2, do any of the exceptions apply? Unfortunately, there are no exceptions that apply for birthday gifts. I wish there were, but they're not. Step 3, do you have a legislative or administrative interest in the decisions of your manager? In this case, yes. As a city staff member, you are always considered to have an administrative interest in your manager and anyone else who has a say in your salary. So in this case, the gift needs to be limited to $50 or less. The next area we're going to talk about is the prohibited use of office provisions. The prohibited use of office provisions are also known as the but-for prohibitions, and I'll explain this a little bit in a minute. Public officials cannot use their public positions for financial gain or avoidance, the promise of future employment, use of confidential information gained through public office, or representation before the governing body for a fee. what you need to ask yourself is, but for my position as a public official, would I have been provided with or offered the same opportunity? The first one of these is financial gain or avoidance. Public officials are prohibited from using or attempting to use their official position or office to obtain financial gain or avoid financial detriment for themselves, a relative, or household member. And I want to note, it does not matter how minimal this financial gain is. So it could be $1, it could be $1,000. It does not matter. Any amount is where there should be a red flag raised. And there's important tie-in with gifts and the prohibition against financial gain or detriment. If a public official or relative accepts a lawful gift or a lawful financial benefit that qualifies as an exception to the definition of the gift, the statute, which is found in ORS 244-0401, does not prohibit the acceptance. So, if you receive a gift and either there's no administrative or legislative interest, or if the amount is under $50, or if the item qualifies for one of those listed exceptions as a gift, that receipt of that item is not considered a violation of this provision. And the reasoning behind this is, unlike gifts which come from outside sources, the prohibited use of office provision focuses on the public official's own action. What else is not considered financial gain? Okay, your official compensation package. And I want to note as well that a lot of elected leaders in our cities are actually not paid. It's really more of a volunteer job. But your official compensation package can include items such as travel reimbursements, whatever small stipend you may receive, and other items. Anything that has been officially passed as a policy that is financially related can be considered part of your official compensation package. The next item is honorarium related to the public official's position with a maximum value of $50 or related to your private occupation, avocation, or expertise. The reimbursement of approved expenses. Unsolicited awards for professional achievement. And again, contributions to your legal expense trust fund. Now, honorarium is kind of one of those weird things that has a weird definition, but we'll go through it. Honorarium is defined as payment or something of economic value given in exchange for services upon which custom or propriety prevents the setting of a price. Services includes things such as speeches or other services rendered in connection with an event. Now, the best way that I am able to tell what is honorarium, what is not, is to ask yourself a couple of questions. First, you want to make sure the offer of payment or something of economic value was not arranged or agreed to before I provided the service. So I wasn't asked to give a speech and then also told, if I give this speech, I will be provided with this item. The services provided by the public official must precede the offer of payment or something of economic value. So again, I had to give the speech first before being offered anything at all. And finally, the payment or something of economic value must be delivered in return for and following the delivery of the services. So again, another roundabout way of saying, I gave the speech without the expectation of any payment, and then after I gave the speech, I so happened to be provided with kind of a thank you gift. So let's run through a couple more hypotheticals. A public works employee stores her parents' motorhome in an otherwise empty city storage facility, typically used for storing the city's heavy equipment. The storage facility is only accessible to city staff. May the employee do this? The answer here we're going to have to look at is, well, is this something that was only available but for the employee's position as a public official? And the answer is yes. This was not something that general members of the public had any access to. And remember, the financial gain provisions also apply to your relatives. So in this case, But for the public works employee's position at the city, her parents would never have had the ability to store their RV at the city facility. And in doing so, they are avoiding a financial detriment of having to pay rent somewhere else to store their RV. A volunteer firefighter is preparing the exterior of his house for painting. The fire department has a power washer available to loan out to the general public. May the firefighter borrow the power washer? In this case, the answer is yes, he may. And it's not because he's a volunteer. Remember, the volunteer firefighter is still considered a public official, even though they may not be paid. The reason why this is acceptable is because the hypothetical mentioned that the fire department has the power washer available to loan out to the general public. The firefighter would have had access to the power washer regardless of whether or not he was working for the city. So in this case, this is permitted. 2 city councilors would like to attend a local event called the City Community Leadership Awards and Auction. The event recognizes and honors community leaders who demonstrate leadership in volunteerism, business, and educational achievement. The event includes a sit-down dinner at an upscale event center. May the councilors request the city pay for their tickets to attend the event. Presumably, they'd like to attend in their official roles as city councilors. Well, in this case, yes, they may. Generally speaking, they are serving in their official capacity as city councilors, and this is a reimbursable city expense. The second prohibited use of office provision is the promise of future employment. And this one's pretty straightforward. A public official may not solicit or receive, either directly or indirectly, and any person may not offer or give to any public official any pledge or promise of future employment based on any understanding that the vote, official action, or judgment of the public official would be influenced by the pledge or promise. I don't think we need any hypotheticals to really understand what this means. Please do not say or offer someone a job on the understanding that they will vote or make a decision on a certain way. The next one is the use of confidential information gained through public office. A public official may not attempt to further their personal gain through the use of confidential information gained in the course of or by reason of holding their position or activities of the public official. And this includes after the public official no longer serves in their official role. So for example, if you learn confidential information as a city councilor or a city staff member, you cannot then go out and use that confidential information to your advantage. And even after you are no longer an elected official or you move on to a different job, you still cannot use that information to your advantage. Now, I do want to say, though, if the information you learned as a public official is not confidential and something that is generally known to the public, then you may use it for any financial benefit. Finally, representing a client before a governing body for a fee. A person may not attempt to represent a client for a fee before the governing body of the public body of which the person is a member. This prohibition does not apply to a person's employer, business partner, or other associate. Let's walk through a hypothetical to really flesh out this one. A city councilor would like to engage in a private business endeavor wherein the councilor would help landowners and developers plan their developments by assembling the teams of experts needed for a project, such as lawyers, architects, civil engineers, surveyors, preparing the application required to be submitted to the appropriate land use body, and representing the owner where authorized and necessary. The councilor proposes to represent clients before the Planning Commission. However, if any decision is to be made by the City Council, either quasi-judicially or legislatively in nature, where the councilor may appear to have a personal interest, the councilor will step down and leave the council chambers. can the counselor represent a firm before the Planning Commission? Well, in this case, the counselor could represent a client before the Planning Commission because he does not sit on the Planning Commission itself. He sits on the City Council. However, if that land use decision is then being decided by the City Council, then the counselor would not be able to represent the client for a fee. He could either, one, represent the client for free, or have either, if he's part of a firm, have his partner represent them or someone else at his firm represent them. Now, if the counselor chooses to represent the client for free, then he may have to recuse himself, and we're going to talk about what that means next. Conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest outside of gifts is probably the number one area of ethics laws that I get the most questions about. What is a conflict of interest? A conflict of interest is participation in an official action that would or could result in a financial benefit to the public official, a relative, or a business in which either are associated. A potential conflict is when the action taken by the public official could have a financial impact on that official, relative, or business. An actual conflict of interest is when the action taken by the public official would have a financial impact on that official, relative, or business. And the real importance here are on the words would or could, because whether it's a potential conflict or an actual conflict, what the public official must do next depends on those two things. For potential conflicts of interest, all the public official needs to do is announce or disclose the conflict. If it's an actual conflict of interest, the public official must announce or disclose and recuse themselves. And what does recusal mean? So recusal really just means that the public official cannot take into he cannot participate in any sort of discussion or deliberation or vote on the matter. But at the league here, what we recommend is that if you ever have to recuse yourself, you should also step down from the dais and leave the room. And the reason why we recommend that is because it just takes away any sort of visual look that that public official is participating in the matter in any way. Now, depending on whether you are an elected official or a staff member, how you disclose your conflict varies. As an elected official or as an appointed member to a board or council, you must publicly announce the nature of the conflict, and the notice must be recorded in the official records of the public body. In most instances, these are the public meeting minutes. The announcement of the conflict must be made at each meeting or at each occasion the issue is discussed or debated. Now, it doesn't matter how obvious the conflict is or if everybody in the whole room knows about the conflict, you still need to make the announcement and it still needs to be recorded. If you are a staff member, you need to disclose the conflict in writing to your appointing or employee authority. And then upon receipt of that request, the appointing authority must designate an alternative to dispose of the matter or direct the official to dispose of the matter in a manner specified by the appointing authority. Essentially, what needs to be done is that the appointing authority needs to remove all discretion away from the public employee. Now, there are exceptions. If the conflict arises from a membership or interest held in a particular business, industry, occupation, or other class that was a prerequisite for holding the public position, it is not considered a conflict of interest. A great example of this is that most typically, in order to sit on council, you must be a resident of your city. So any decision that you make that impacts residents of your city are not considered conflicts of interest because you had to have that prerequisite before holding office. If the financial impact of the official action would impact the public official, relative, or business to the same degree as other members of an identifiable group or class. Now, I have an asterisk next to this one, and that's because the only authority that can designate or identify an identifiable group or class is the Oregon Government Ethics Commission. So please don't assume that you are part of a group or class without first calling the commission and asking them to designate a group or class for you. Third, if the conflict arises from a membership in or membership on the board of directors of a nonprofit 503c corporation. Any sort of conflicts like that are actually not considered conflicts of interest for the provisions of the ethics laws. Another item we need to talk about is considered and called the rule of necessity. If an actual conflict of interest exists, but the public official's vote is necessary to meet the minimum number of votes required for official action, the public official may vote out of necessity. Now note, this does not apply where there are insufficient votes because of a member's absent. It only applies when a quorum is lacking solely because the member must refrain due to the conflict. So you still need to disclose that there is a conflict, and you still may not discuss the matter with anybody else, but you can just solely vote. If you think this applies, please reach out to the commission just to verify, and potentially even your city attorney just to make sure, because this is very rare and often rarely applies. Let's run through more hypotheticals. In her private capacity, a city councilor is employed as an executive director of a 501c nonprofit economic development organization that advocated for the healthy economic development of the Southern Oregon region and provides its members with a common voice on shared issues. The City Council is considering whether to allocate and disperse funds to the organization, such as approving the city's membership fees to the organization and authorizing city funds for staff and councilors to attend the organization's events and conferences. May the councilor take any action, decision, or vote on whether to allocate or disperse funds on the organization? The answer here is no, she may not. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, didn't we just talk about how membership in or sitting on the board of directors of a nonprofit was considered an exception? Well, yes, that is true. But we have to remember in this hypothetical that the city councilor is employed as the executive director. She does not sit on the board of directors, and therefore, she probably stands to have a financial benefit should the city vote in a certain way. Therefore, she must announce the conflict of interest and recuse herself from any decision or deliberations on the matter. A budget committee member has a spouse who is a city employee. The budget committee members make budget recommendations to the city council, which is the body that ultimately determines the budget. Does the committee member have a conflict of interest? So, anytime that this budget committee would be discussing her spouse's salary or her spouse's department, then yes, she would have a conflict of interest. However, she would only have a potential conflict of interest. So her decisions as a budget committee member could potentially have an impact on herself or her spouse. And this is because the budget committee isn't the ultimate decision maker on the city's budget. Now, what if the public official is not a budget committee member, but rather the city councilor? Well, the hypothetical states that the ultimate decision on the city's budget falls on the city council. In this case, the city councilor would have to only also announce, but also recuse herself from any time that the budget was discussed on her spouse's department or any other financial area that would impact her spouse, and also as the city budget as a whole. And nepotism. Now, technically speaking, the ethics laws don't address nepotism. However, if you find yourself in a situation where you're working closely with relatives or whatnot, there are a couple considerations you'll want to take in mind. So you and your relative can be employed by the same public employer at the same time, or serve on the same governing body at the same time. However, public officials cannot participate in any personnel action taken by the public body that would impact the employment of a relative or member of the public official's household. Public officials may not directly supervise a relative or household member either. Now, there are ways in which the city policy can it can be developed to where there may be some ways around this. Now, if you are considering this, please look at Oregon Administrative Rules 199, 005, 0080 from some guidance on those policies. And I also want to note, the state ethics laws don't prohibit all of this, but your local city may have a charter provision or local ordinance or other policy that may. So please always check with your own city. Private employment by public officials. Again, for the purposes of local government, the state ethics laws does not prohibit the private employment or address the private employment of public officials. However, you want to always keep in mind that public officials are not to engage in private business activities on their city's time. A city's supplies, facilities, equipment, employees, records, or other public resources are not to be used to engage in private business interests. The position as a public official is not to be used to take official action that could have a financial impact on a private business with which the public official, a relative, or member of the public official's household are associated. Confidential information gained as a public official is not to be used to obtain a financial benefit for the public official, a relative, or member of the public official's household or business in which either are associated. And again, you're going to always want to watch out for conflicts of interests. And our last area we're going to talk about today is a statement of economic interest. The statement of economic interest has an annual filing requirement, and it's required to be filed every year by all elected officials, the city manager or principal administrator, municipal judges, and planning commission members. Now, this is not an exclusive list, so if you're not sure if this applies to you, you want to check ORS 244-050. Currently, the Statement of Economic Interest is completed online, and it has an April 15th deadline. So why do we care? And what are some items that you're going to disclose on your SEI? Well, you're going to disclose certain business interests, certain sources of income, ownership interest in real property other than your main home, honorarium received in excess of $15 in value. Now remember, we talked about honorarium in which you could receive up to $50, but you have to report anything received in excess of $15. Names of compensated lobbyists with associated business interest, name of entities in which the official received over $50 to participate in convention, fact-finding missions, trips, negotiations, economic development activities, or other meetings. Again, there may not be limits outside of this, but you still have to report anything received over $50. For a complete list, see ORS 244-060 and 244-070. So what if I decide to ignore this and say, I don't want to go through all that work? Well, there's a late filing fee of $10 for each of the first 14 days after April 15th. And then that late filing fee increases to $50 for each day after the first 14 until the maximum penalty of $5,000 is reached. Now, the important thing to note about the SEI is that typically there's going to be a jurisdictional contact with your city who is going to work with the commission to determine who within the city needs to file. You want to make sure that this contact, which is probably your city recorder, has an email address on file that you actually check. Because what's going to happen is that the commission is going to send you usually a heads up and a notice around March that you have the SEI filing deadline coming. And if it's an email that you never check, you might miss it. So just verify who that jurisdictional contact is with your city and make sure you have an appropriate email on file. And finally, if you have further questions on this, the best resource, again, is the Oregon Government Ethics Commission. I have their website, email, and phone listed on the slide there. They also have a published guide for public officials, which is super helpful, and my understanding is that they're probably going to update it pretty soon, so keep checking that. Another resource I have is your city attorney. Now, I'm a little hesitant to put this as a resource because Violations of the state ethics law are actually personal in nature, and you have to remember your city attorney does not represent you individually, they represent the city as a whole. But what your city attorney will probably be able to do is to point you in the right direction and to kind of give you general guidance on who you should reach out to and who you should talk to. And finally, Patty and I here at the League, again, we are not your personal attorney, we are attorneys for the League, but we are more than happy to point you in the right direction. And with that, stay tuned for a live Q&A on how we can further answer your questions about ethics. Hi everyone, Jamie here with Patty, here for your question and answer sessions about ethics.
The first one is, does the Ethics Commission receive training specifically about home rule?
Well, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't believe that they do specifically receive training on home rule. And that can be very frustrating, I think, because sometimes the laws, when they apply to local government and specifically to cities, there can be disconnects. We have had former city officials or people who represent local government sit on the Government Ethics Commission. So I know that there have been voices who are familiar with local government on the commission. With that, I also encourage local government officials and you, people attending today on the meeting, to apply when there are vacancies. I don't have the complete process in front of me about how to apply. It's on the commission website, but I think that would be a great positive benefit to everybody in the room. Any other questions, Lisa?
Yeah, the next one is, what is considered a reasonable expense?
So I guess, is there kind of a context with that? Is it because of one of the exceptions to the gift exceptions? What I would look at first, so I would kind of first use your common sense, but that can be reasonable to me, could be different from what is reasonable to Patty, and it could be different from anybody else. I would look at the statute. I would then look at the administrative rules. So a lot of times the statutes provide kind of the basic rules, and the administrative rules, so the OARs, will kind of define and further define those statutes. So I'd look in those two places. And if you still have questions, I would ask maybe a city attorney who might be more familiar with the statutes and the OARs, who could maybe direct you in the right way. You could call the League and ask Patty and I that question, and if it's in there, we can ask you. Unfortunately, I don't have it memorized, so if it's not in there, then the next step would be to contact the commission and ask them for clarification specific to the expense that you're thinking of. Patty, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I would say, in my experience, most cities, if it's a training that you're going to or some type of travel, so I would, I've had this question before, in the sense that, you know, if you have a conference that you're going to in downtown Portland and there's a specific hotel associated with the conference, that's probably going to be a reasonable expense to stay at the conference hotel. If you have a meeting and you have a choice between, say, staying at a Best Western, and I don't know if there's, you know, a 5-star hotel that runs $700 or $800 a night in downtown Portland, I would go out on a limb and say that $700 a night hotel room is probably not reasonable. So some of it, as Jamie said earlier, is going to be common sense. If you can't find it in the statutes or the Ethics Commission, you could certainly run it by me and Jamie, and we can give you some general guidance and our thoughts on things as well.
Next question, Lisa.
I am not seeing any yet.
So what I'll add while we're waiting to see if there's any other questions, I think a lot of times people are a little hesitant or nervous to call the commission to ask their questions. We've had to call the commission for our own questions regarding league work or our own work as public officials. The staff there, they're super friendly, very nice. Their goal is to educate. You can always ask your question in a hypothetical, which can be helpful. But again, they want you to learn. They would rather you call first and ask maybe a very obvious question, than for you to make a small mistake and then, you know, have to be reported. So please call them. They're nice. They're not scary. It's a super great resource.
Okay, and we have a question from Mayor Cross. If you want to go ahead and unmute your line.
I'm asking it live because I ran out of room typing it. Are these rules fairly uniform across the United States? And the reason I ask that is because of traveling to conventions, government conventions out of state, and what they offer, for lack of a better word, as amenities, whether that be like National League of Cities. One of the things that was supposedly on tap this year before COVID hit was to offer to take any attendees out to a football game. And so I was, I'm looking at that going, I can't do it, but that seems like if they're offering that, wouldn't that be okay there? And so that's why I'm asking those kind of questions.
Yeah, so it's tough sometimes when the laws vary. So my understanding, and I'll probably defer to Patty on this because she has experience working outside of the state. My experience is all within the state of Oregon, is that we actually probably have more of the more stringent ethics laws. Has that been your experience, Patty? Or
Yeah, so I come from a Midwestern state, Mayor. I think you may even know which state. And I always jokingly say that the only thing we cared about in my state was bribery and embezzlement. But no, I mean, I think Oregon, from looking at it holistically, from the states that I've worked with and colleagues I have in other states, is you do have much more stringent requirements in Oregon in terms of kind of what you can or cannot take as an elected official. When it comes to trips like the NLC, I think I would say that if you had a baseball game or a basketball game or something that you wanted to attend with that function, talk about it with your city attorney or give me and Jamie a call, and that's when I would probably want to ask the Ethics Commission, because it could be incidental to the actual conference and there might be a way we could make it work. So I think your first instinct though is right to be like, whoa, maybe I'm not supposed to, but I would say, having practiced in other states and having friends and colleagues who practice government law in other states, Oregon is certainly unique in the stringency of its ethics requirements for elected officials.
Thank you, Patty. That's what I kind of thought, but figured I'd throw it out there because it really struck me as, wow, they can actually do that.
I think, Mayor Cross, you may have heard this story from me. So my husband is a public official as well, and here in Oregon, and he was back in Indiana. He was a fire chief for a large department. Anyway, he went to a function one time when he first came home, and he comes home and he has a goodie bag, and it's full of all kinds of things, from a massage to multiple rounds of golf, teeth whitening, and he's all excited. And the lawyer and Patty is having a panic attack. I'm like, you can't take any of this. This is more than $50. You have to take this all back. And so even though he'd had some ethics training from his city, he was under this assumption, practicing for 30 or 40 years in a different jurisdiction where this was just a goodie bag and you could take it regardless of the cost. So I think it is a lot more stringent here in Oregon. I did make him give everything back except the candy bar, for those who are curious.
all right, Lisa, anything else?
Yep, we have another question.
Perfect.
Is there a potential ethical issue with receiving support in the form of campaigning for and soliciting donations in support of election for office by a lobbyist who represents a union whose membership are employed by their city, and the contract will be negotiated on by the city council on which they serve? That's a mouthful. Let me know if you need me to repeat that.
So that is a very specific question. And I can't go and answer that question legally and give you legal advice on that question. But I do see a couple of things. So I see, okay, potentially there's finances involved. So as I mentioned during the presentation, the Ethics Commission primarily focuses on whether or not you're receiving financial benefits. That raises a red flag. Though, however, the second thing is that campaign finance is kind of a separate area of law. So there may be different restrictions, or there may be no restrictions on how you receive campaign finance and how that interplays with your role as a current public official. And then lobbying is something that we didn't cover in the presentation, but is under the jurisdiction of the commission. So that is a perfect example of something where I'm going to recommend send an email to the commission or give them a call. It's a very specific question and it's very nuanced, and so it's definitely something that I would ask because it's not clear. Patty, did you have a follow-up on that, or what you would do in that situation?
I would email the commission. I will be honest, if that was my city, so if you had come to me as a city attorney, that would be the first thing I would do, is I would type an email up to the commission, because as Jamie said, there's multiple layers and multiple different types of red flags. And just because it's a red flag doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means use some caution and make sure you're checking first. So this is one that you should check with the commission.
All right, Lisa?
Yes, we have another one. Is there anything in writing, like in ORS or some rule or anywhere else about conflicts of interest and about procedure or, what is this, recusing? The idea is to share it with new counselors whose spouse works for the city and the whole council and the mayor, so everyone understands how to deal with it.
Okay, so whenever you find yourself presented with either an actual or potential conflict of interest, the statute does specify what steps you need to take. So if it's a potential conflict of interest, and that is when the matter you're discussing or you're presented to impacts you in some way, but you're not the ultimate decision maker. So when that occurs, that's a potential conflict of interest. The only thing that the statute requires you to do is to announce it every time it's discussed. So at that council meeting or at a board or a commission meeting, you have to say, hi, I have a potential conflict of interest. It is, and then explain and describe the potential conflict. And then the person who takes the minutes for that meeting just has to make sure that that disclosure is recorded. If you have an actual conflict of interest, so your decision on the matter would impact the outcome or potential, then you have to not only disclose in the method that I just described, you would actually have to recuse yourself. So the state law only requires you to recuse yourself as in where you won't participate in the discussions or vote on the matter. It doesn't require you to leave the room or to otherwise take any extra steps. At the league, which I mentioned in the presentation, we recommend that you step down from the council dais if you're a counselor and actually leave the room. And the reason why we recommend that is because, let's say it's a really heated topic and the fact that you have a conflict of interest is kind of a big deal. You wouldn't want someone taking a picture of the council meeting and have that appearance that you are participating because you're pictured in that picture. So if you leave the room, you really can't have any sort of misunderstanding. Patty, any other suggestions on local procedures or?
Yeah, so not necessarily on the procedures. The tip, I think I heard in the question that you wanted to share this with some new counselors, particularly because you might have a counselor who has a spouse that's an employee. The only two tips is if we have not bored you here today, you're welcome to share this recording with them. We hope to have them available on our website in January. And the other option is Jamie's slides mentioned at the very end, the Government Ethics Commission has a local public officials guide, and there's a section in there that deals with conflicts of interest. And so if you're looking for something from kind of a reputable source and authority, I would actually pull out that conflict of interest section from that guide and share it with your entire council and maybe even the employees in question, because I think that would kind of bolster some of what you're conveying that you learned here today.
Any other questions, Lisa?
I am not seeing any others at the moment. Oh, here we got one. Can you clarify when they should declare a potential conflict of interest, before a discussion or before a vote?
Sure. So if you know there's an agenda item and you know you will have a potential conflict of interest, then when the presiding officer says we are now going to discuss agenda item B, I would right away say, excuse me, I have a potential conflict of interest. It also might be helpful to let the presiding officer know ahead of time so that they can ask, does anybody have any potential conflict of interest or actual conflict of interest? What happens sometimes, though, is that you don't know that you have a potential or actual conflict of interest. And through the discussions that are occurring during the meeting or whenever else, you realize that red flag's been raised. I would, politely, at the appropriate point, so whether you can just politely raise your hand and say, excuse me, I'm starting to realize that I have a potential conflict of interest here. I would do it as soon as you know. So again, when you know ahead of time, right when the agenda item is presented, and then when it occurs during the agenda item, then I would raise the flag as soon as you figure that out. Great question. Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any.
And after this Q&A session, we do have a break for lunch. Lisa, can you remind us when that break is and when we return?
Yeah, so the break will be as soon as this Q&A is over, and it will be done at 1 o'clock, and after that will be the public meetings portion.
All right. We'll give you a minute to add in any last minute questions. Again, if something you think about after this presentation is over, feel free to send an email to Patty or myself, and we'd be happy to answer any other follow-up questions.
So before we sign off, because it doesn't look like y'all are chomping at the bit to ask us questions, the other thing I would say, and which is good, is the Oregon Government Ethics Commission website has some opinions, and they're kind of categorized by topic. So if you are ever interested in learning more about what the commission thinks about something like conflicts of interest or gift limitations, you can go on their website and look, and they'll give you some pretty good guidance and tips on there. It's another good resource if you're looking for it, or as Jamie mentioned, you can call us and we can do that research for you.
What about a retirement gift? Can that gift be over $50?
Sure, this is actually a really good question. So if the person is still technically employed and they are still a public official, then the $50 limit would apply. I'll give you an example though. We, about a year ago, had a staff member at LOC, and we're all public officials at LOC. He was retiring and we wanted to gift him a fairly expensive gift that was over the $50 limit. So you can do two things. The gift could be from multiple people so that individually there wasn't anybody contributing more than $50, or you can wait to gift the gift after the person officially retires. So as you know, the day after they are officially done and no longer employed, they are no longer a public official. So there's two options to get around that.
Okay, the next question is, what if the city council is paying for the city manager, I'm going to read that again. What if the city council is paying for the city manager to keep engineers' license? Is the city manager allowed to oversight and approve projects, then present to council for decisions?
So can you clarify that again, Lisa? Can you read that?
Yeah, so what if the city council is paying for the city manager to keep his engineer's license? If the city manager, is the city manager allowed to oversight and approve projects, then present to council for decisions?
So with all questions, if my response isn't clear, I again would direct you to contact the Ethics Commission. But my general perception is that as long as the city manager, so if their duties include the city management duties, but they are also employed to oversee certain maybe technical engineering things due to their additional certifications, then I don't see a huge red flag there. For example, the league pays for my bar dues to be an attorney for the league, and they utilize me for legal advice. And so that payment of my licensure is not a violation of the ethics laws. But I would just confirm, check in with your city attorney, check in with the Ethics Commission if that might be a slightly different situation. I don't know, Patty, do you have anything additional to ask about that one?
No, I mean, I agree with Jamie. If it's part of if they have dual job duties, I think that's probably acceptable. So like, for example, myself, I play dual roles at the league. I'm not just the lawyer, I'm also the human resources administrator. So those sometimes seem like they might occasionally be in conflict, but we're able to work our way through them. So if you've got a specific issue or concern or project, I'd talk about it with the city manager and your city attorney just to make sure. And as Jamie mentioned, always double check with the Ethics Commission if you think there could be a potential conflict of interest or some type of overlap that impacts those statutes.
Okay, next question. When a council person announces the nature of the conflict and the meeting is virtual, does that person need to log out of the virtual meeting?
So by the state standards, no, that person does not. As I mentioned previously during the recorded portion, we recommend that once you announce a conflict and you are required to recuse yourself, so I'm going to assume this is an actual conflict of interest where you have that extra requirement to recuse, to leave the room. So in the Zoom context, what I would recommend is that if you have an actual conflict of interest, you would, of course, disclose the conflict, and then I would log off. But that's not required by the state law. I would add, though, that your city may have an additional requirement that is not contained in the state law. So if your city has a local provision that says if you have an actual conflict, not only must you recuse yourself, you must, leave the room or leave the Zoom meeting, then of course follow those provisions, but it's not required by the state law. Lisa?
Okay. The next question. I am a math teacher and a real estate agent. I have a client who is a developer. He on many occasions has needed to get zoning changes. Am I still allowed to represent him, or how is it that this is how I make a living, or do I have to recuse myself?
So there's kind of two parts to the question. So what the law prohibits is for you to represent your client in front of the city council. And I'm assuming the question is from a city councilor. So if the city council is in charge of making a decision and you are actually representing the client in front of the city council for a fee, then you could not do that. Now, even if you're not representing your client in front of the council, if you believe that the decision you're about to make as a city councilor will have a financial impact on you. So I guess there could be multiple ways that could occur to where maybe the client is paying you, if this is a successful project, we'll pay you a premium. Then yes, announce the conflict, and then if it becomes an actual conflict, recuse yourself. Patty, do you have anything to add on that one?
No, I think Jamie's correct. The only thing I always say with conflicts too, and have a conversation, because every city's different, is there's the ethics requirements, like Jamie says, the minimum, the floor that the state requires, and then there's what I like to call the ethic issues that make us feel funny in our stomach, right? Where you're just like, I know it's legally correct, but I feel funny about this. When those kinds of questions arise or those issues arise, you should also feel free to talk with your city manager or maybe the mayor and say, look, I really know that I legally can, but I'm uncomfortable with it. And that's because some cities are fine and just say, look, if you don't feel like you can be impartial or neutral, then you shouldn't participate. Other cities essentially say you have an obligation to participate in all votes in which you don't have a conflict of interest. You were elected to make really hard, uncomfortable decisions, and this is one of those. But I always appreciated it when I was a practicing city attorney, and I know some of the city managers I've worked with appreciate it as well. We'd rather know in advance that you've got that pit in your stomach and feel awkward about something, even if there's no legal barrier, because we want to be able to help you work through that issue and make sure that we're all fundamentally sound in doing our best.
Okay, the next question. What if a city councilor discloses the potential conflict? Does the attorney have privilege to decide if it is or is not? What if your potential conflict is not recorded?
So the only jurisdiction or body or person who is in charge of overseeing whether or not something actually is a conflict or not is the commission. So if the city attorney really doesn't have any say, so if you said, hey, city attorney, do I have an actual conflict? And they say no, and unfortunately they were incorrect, that doesn't really give you any sort of safe harbor in that context. So double check with the Ethics Commission. And Lisa, can you please repeat the second part of the question?
Yes. Sorry, I was moving around. What if the potential conflict is not recorded?
Okay, so as you know, it is a requirement to be recorded, in the minutes. Sometimes life happens, and like Patty talked about earlier, give yourself grace, it happens. Either when those minutes are due to be approved at the next meeting, I would bring it up and say, I have a correction to the minutes. This wasn't recorded, it should have been, or at the next time that item's discussed, to bring it up and make sure that it is then recorded the second time.
Okay. Next question. When filing an SEI, is it for all properties you own or just properties within your jurisdiction?
So that's a great question. I don't know the specifics. What I would do then is reach out to the commission and ask them, because there are very, very specific items that they ask for. So just check the commission. There are the Oregon administrative rules, but oftentimes a phone call is just a lot quicker. Just give them a call, they'll know the answer, they'll tell you exactly what you need to disclose and not. Also, they are not going to penalize you for disclosing more than you need to. So if you're ever unclear and you're unable to get a hold of somebody, just disclose it and they'll just say thank you, for that extra information. It's not going to hurt anything.
They're also super helpful. I sit on my city's landmarks commission, so I have to fill out an SEI. And the first time I did it, I was a little too lawyerly. I got a little bit too much in my head and was reading the questions in about 20 different ways. And I called, she answered my first question, I hung up. I had a second question, I called back. The third time I called her in 5 minutes, she said, why don't we just fill out the form together? So they are incredibly helpful. They're not judgmental at all. So literally just call their office. It'll be on the bottom of the SEI information they send you if you've got questions, and they are literally kind and gracious enough to walk through the entire form with you.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, Patty. Actually, I should have mentioned earlier, their goal is to educate. So they don't want to, have a claim against you. They're not out to get you. What they want you to do is that when in doubt, just ask. And they are super friendly. Each of us had a call for league work. We've had a call with questions, even as attorneys, that probably I don't know, the law's unclear sometimes. And we just call, and they're super gracious, and they want to educate. So just call, they're super nice. If you are a little nervous about maybe indicting yourself, phrase the question as a hypothetical, but pick up the phone, they're great. Send an email, you'll get an answer.
Okay, I don't see any more questions at this time.
Okay, so if you have any last minute questions, we'll give you a minute or two to type it out. In the meantime, even if you're a little nervous about contacting the commission, you can always ask Patty or I to review your question. We can always help you frame it in a way that might get you the answer that you're looking for. Or even if you're just like, I'm not even sure what my question is, just talk to us. We're happy to help you out. And we might not be able to provide you with the actual answer, but we can maybe get there in a more direct way. Patty, any other last minute things that I'm forgetting probably?
Yeah, so the only other thing I would add, Jamie put it up on her last slide, the Oregon Government Ethics Commission does have a guide for public officials. She mentioned it's going to be updated. It's actually a really user-friendly short record, and if you are new to public office here in Oregon, or you're a relatively new city employee, city manager, or recorder, you can go onto their website and download it, and I would really recommend reading it. If you're somebody who kind of keeps handy desk references around, I have a printed copy that I use kind of honestly as a cheat sheet. So, if I get a question that I'm not sure about, I'll start with the guide, because 9 times out of 10, if it doesn't give me the answer I need, it will point me in the direction I need to go to find the answer. So of all of the resources you can get from the state and from the league, that's probably the most helpful when it comes to ethics, and it's not very long to read. They've got it nicely organized by topics. It's a good resource to consider just keeping with you, and as kind of a go-to place to just read maybe once or twice a year to kind of just keep yourself familiar with the basic topics regarding ethics.
While you're thinking or brainstorming or typing away furiously, we kind of wanted to talk about the difference between the state minimum bar set for the ethics and kind of the public perception. I know, Scott, you have some comments about that.
Well, I think this is really important. There's certainly state law can get you in trouble if you violate state ethics law, but there's also community perception. In my years in this business, I've seen quite a few controversies where the public lost confidence in either the city manager or elected officials because of the perceived ethics that they had. And I always like to remind people, once you get elected, you're a public official, and what you do can wind up in the Oregonian or in CNN. And I've had CNN roll into town before, and it's never a good day when national media shows up to cover a controversy involving your ethics. So. Perceptions about relationships, perceptions about business arrangements. It's important to remember that as a city councilor, people view you differently than you viewed yourself before you were a city councilor. People will want to do things to garner your support because they think maybe you might be of use to them or their business interests down the road. So you just have to be very careful about that and just have an awareness about what your role is in interacting with people. Maybe they're old friends, and in your mind that relationship hasn't changed, but once you're elected, things do change just a little bit. And the more aware you are of that, and the more you consider that in the decisions you make, the better off you'll be. And the other thing I'd encourage you to do is that if there's ever a question about ethics, if you're unsure, how's this going to look? Talk it out. Find your city manager, find your city attorney, and say, I've got this concern. Let's sort this out before I do this. How's this going to look? How's this going to be perceived? Is it going to put me in a difficult position down the road? And I'll give you an example of a lesson that I learned, and this is a real example that happened to me. Many years ago, I was the chair of a fundraising committee for a very worthy local nonprofit, and I asked some businesses to donate toward the cause, and they did. Several months later, you know where this is going, they called me up and they wanted me to help them out with a permit. Of course, I didn't think that was appropriate and told them so, and they said, well, you know, Scott, we gave to your cause and now you can't help us out? And that's when I realized, you know, I saw myself as somebody trying to do something good for the community, but the people donating to my cause that I was advocating for saw it as helping me out, and that they wanted that to be reciprocal. And so I learned my lesson that way. You have to be very careful with these things when you're out and about in the community.
Thanks, Scott. It's great,
Sure.
great comments. Julie, is there anything that we have now?
We do have a hand raised. Rebecca Salinas Oliveros, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you for your time today. My question is, what is considered city time for city council members?
Do you mean as in when are you officially serving as a city councilor, or can you kind of clarify that a little bit, please?
Yes, there was a part of your presentation that was talking about not doing other type of official business or work when you're on time. And I'm wondering, you know, as city council members, we are at the city council meetings, and of course we wouldn't be doing any official business but that at that time. So I guess I just want clarification. I know that we're always on as public officials, I get that, but so I just want clarification of that.
Sure, great. So now I understand your question. So it's a little more difficult with elected officials. I'll start with the staff. So with staff, it's pretty clear when you're on city time. So when you're at the office working, but even as an official, so when you're, you know, obviously at council meetings and whatnot, that's pretty clear. But what the provision is really focused on is the utilization of city resources. So if you're at home, you know, and you're doing something in a private matter, you're probably fine. Now then, if you call, you know, a staff person, or, you know, say, hey, Scott, I have this thing I'm working on, you mind helping me out here? Now you're going to be on city time. Now you're utilizing your city resources. Is that clear then, kind of where that difference is?
Yes, that helps. Thank you.
Okay, Scott, do you have anything to add to that? Or?
No.
Okay.
But for example, if I had a consulting business and I was operating my business while I was working at City Hall, then that would be a problem.
Great question. Thank you.
We have a question in the chat. Do you have any advice for a counselor who is actively looking for employment while maintaining their elected position?
Yeah. And you'll hear about this comment a little later on in a different presentation by Kirk Mylander. You will never want to say, do you know who I am? Okay, so never mention, I am a city councilor for this city, you need to hire me because of that. So keep that clear. Don't use your influence to gain a job or any other sort of financial influence. It is okay. Let's say you have a lot of experience in government work. You've been involved in local government for a long time. It is okay to rely upon that experience to, you know, apply for jobs and have a job. But you don't ever want to say, you know, hey, please, if you give me this job, it might influence your appeal you have in front of the city council or anything of that matter. But it's not to say, so for example, myself, I've been a public official my entire career, either with the league or with the state agency. And I was still able to use the skill set that I gained at my prior job and apply that to when I applied for my job at the league. So that's certainly permissible. Scott, anything that you can think of?
No, I think that's pretty good advice. And really the responsibility for ethical conduct is on you. And so you don't want to create any impression that you're going to provide any kind of advantage to any future employer because of your position with the city, that you'll be able to do something for somebody in exchange for employment or gifts or anything else.
Do we have any other questions, Julie?
Mm-hmm. Virginia Stapleton has her hand raised. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. I had a quick question here, something we've been kind of going round and round about here in our own city, talking to counselors trying to figure out how it works if I have a project within my ward that I want to push for and advocate for, but that may increase the value of my home or my neighborhood. How does that work? Would I need to declare a conflict of interest, or would I need to step down while that's being handled?
That's a really great question, and it's going to depend. So I know I mentioned in my presentation, say a vote that applies citywide to say increase property taxes might impact you as a city councilor because you own property in the city, and that's generally okay. But when it comes to more detailed and more specific instances, so maybe it only impacts your ward, that's a great question to reach out to the commission and ask for a potential class exemption. What I will caution is that I know there was a city on the coast, and they were talking about VRBO and transient lodging. And I think almost everybody on that council had owned a vacation rental, or a family member owned a vacation rental. And they asked the commission for a class exemption. And the commission actually declined to do that. And they did that because they said, well, the type of revenue you could receive is going to be dependent on the number of bedrooms your property has, even the location to the beach. So before assuming you have a class exemption, just give the commission a call and they'll tell you yes or no. I know a lot of people are very kind of intimidated by calling the commission. They're the regulatory authority. They could, issue a fine against me. But what I will say is that their number one goal is to educate, and they want to help you stay out of trouble. Give them a call. If you want to kind of call me or Patty beforehand and say, hey, I'm not even quite sure how to ask my question, we can walk you through that and help you with that as well. I know, Scott, you had some
Yeah, one of the
comments on
tools I use is I ask myself, well, who's benefiting from this? And the more the general public benefits, I think the calmer waters you might find yourself in. The more that you benefit personally, the more the flags go up. You should always seek advice from the Oregon Ethics Commission if you're uncertain for sure. But if it's a street plan that was adopted by the council and the street improvement's going to help the value of the neighborhood because of this investment, and it's going to benefit half of the city, that's one thing. If this is a street improvement that's going to go right to your front door, and it's just going to be you that gets the benefit of that, that would be red flags for sure, especially if you were advocating for that improvement just for your property, for example.
Okay, next question. Are there ethics guidelines regarding elected officials giving gifts to others outside of their family in the vein of buying votes? For example, can they buy coffee for their constituents at an event, etc.? And to clarify, when they say in the vein of buying votes, I am referring to the appearance, not the desire to do so.
So this is right down the line of the public perception. So you want to ask your question, think of it as in, okay, I'm really just, I'm meeting with a constituent for coffee, and as just a common gesture, I just recommend if I invite someone to lunch, I'm going to buy them lunch. I'm not trying to buy their vote. I'm not trying to influence them. It's just a nice courtesy. But then does that look like a nice courtesy to someone standing outside to that situation, or does it look like that you're trying to buy the votes? So I think in that case, the fact that you raised the question, it looks like I'm buying votes, probably gives you your answer right there. Is that per se, right off the bat, prohibited? I don't know, but do I want to go there? Probably not. So it might be the public's perception in that case kind of gives you the answer is that let's just avoid that situation and maybe, just politely decline. I don't know. You have thoughts on that, Scott?
Well, I think the public perception issue is something that should always be really the standard here. Does this, if it's anything that's going to undermine your integrity or your ability to fulfill the role as a city councilor or as a mayor, then it's probably best to avoid that. As an elected official, your community members have given you a tremendous amount of trust and responsibility to work in their interest, and so anything that might call that into question should probably be avoided. Your integrity is really the only thing that you have, and the more that you protect that, the more effective you're going to be.
Great. Next question. Is it a conflict of interest if one city employee has final say on their spouse's timesheet, or only a perceived conflict of interest?
So that's going to be specific with the local procedures you have in place with your city. So the response is going to also be dependent on whether or not the final say is from an elected official or from a staff member. I know, and Scott, you might be able to chime in because I know you have more experience working in the administrative side of cities.
Yeah.
Some cities can avoid this issue if they're a really small staff and there is no alternative person to approve payroll. They can put kind of safeguards in place, but it's going to kind of depend. Scott, I don't know if you.
Yeah, I don't know where the question's coming from. Certainly, I winced a little if you saw me when I heard that. It's not a situation I would particularly like. In a very small community, though, where maybe you don't have enough staff for separation of duties and internal controls over finances, it can be an issue. And you can talk with your staff about the perception of that and maybe try to build in some separation of responsibilities there. I know of one community years ago that I worked in where we had an issue like this, and we had a member of the council come in and were able to initial that there was another set of eyes looking and everything was on the up and up. But that's not ideal. Certainly you want to have people who have economic interest separated over management oversight or any kind of financial transactions internally or externally.
Yeah, and I'd recommend that's another great example of a question to ask the commission, because ultimately, let's say you have that conversation with your city and the council and say, how can we safeguard this? And the council and the city decides on one thing, but no one ever asks the commission their opinion. Because ultimately, if it was reported to the commission, they're the ultimate decision makers. So if you ask them for their advice and you rely upon their advice, then you have that safeguard in place.
Next question. I am a private contractor with one of the city departments. The work started prior to becoming a city councilor. Do I need to declare a conflict with the specific department or no longer contract with the specific department? And they clarified it's the city police and they do private investigations, backgrounds.
So the law doesn't require you to ever leave your private profession. What you will likely have to do is whenever the discussion of that specific contract or your work, you'll probably have to recuse yourself, or at a minimum, if it's not quite an actual conflict, if it's just a potential, and I don't know when that's going to be, it's going to have to, every situation you're going to have to look at differently. You will have to disclose at a minimum. This comes up a lot when you have people who, have a private life, but then they decide to run on council, or they have family members who are employed by council. There's not a per se law that says, no, you can't run for council or you must quit your private job. But what might occur is that you may be unable to really serve as a counselor because you have to recuse yourself so often. Scott?
Certainly it's going to require some awareness about where your private interests intersect with the city, and sometimes it can happen in ways that maybe aren't so apparent. So whenever there's a council vote on a financial transaction associated with the police, it may have personnel costs attached to it that might be partly funding some of the work that you do. You just need to be careful about that and make sure that you're aware of those intersections where your private and your public role intersect, and make sure that you handle them accordingly to avoid any trouble.
That is all the questions right now in chat.
How are we doing on time, Julie?
It's 12:15. We were scheduled to go to lunch at 12:30, but we could break early.
Okay, so unless you have any other last minute comments, Scott, I think again, the big focus is, just work on that public perception. When in doubt, ask a more senior staff person or call the commission. I promise you, I've had to call them myself. Patty's had to call them. I don't know if Scott, you've ever had to call them. They're very friendly. They want to just educate.
I have, and I tell people that I have ethical questions that come to me routinely, and it's questions about who's going to pay for coffee, and will I fundraise for, as part of the Rotary auction dinner. Things that seem innocuous before I was a public person now maybe have different connotations to them. And so just be thoughtful about it. Talk about it, ask questions, go to your city manager, and then use the Ethics Commission to protect yourself.
Right.
Jamie, we did get one more question in the chat. What is best practice when applying for a job? Is it appropriate to include an elected official position on a resume, assuming no promise of favor because of the position you served? Or is it better to refrain from including elected office in your resume?
I think if you can leave it off because it has no application skill set wise to the job you're applying for, then I think the safest bet is to leave it off. I do understand though that you do gain a skill set from serving as an elected official or serving for the city in general. And I think there are probably ways to phrase your skill sets and highlight your skill sets without really highlighting the fact that you are an elected official. I don't know, Scott, you have anything additional to add to that? It can be tricky, for sure, but.
Well, it's depending on what you expect to gain out of putting it on there. How are you using your elected city councilor position, and is it to a private gain or for a public benefit? And that's really the question. Is this, am I doing this because it's going to help me personally, or am I doing this because it's part of my role and my duty and responsibility to the community as a city councilor? And these are kind of the questions I think you should ask yourself and make your decision.
We had a follow-up. What if the job is in another city?
Well, I guess you'd have to ask yourself the question, is my position as an elected official, does that have any influence on the people who are interviewing me for the job? And if the answer, if you can say, in your heart that no, there's no way I can influence them by this, then you're probably fine. Again, I think it's a level of comfort, and I think, again, call the commission. They'll let you know yes or no. They're not going to laugh at you for asking a silly question or a question that should be obvious because they understand that a lot of nuances occur. So you're probably safer, of course, if it's not the city that you represent, but every situation's a little different. It's a great question.
All right, I work for a engineering company that works for the city, and what am I allowed to vote on and what am I not allowed to?
That's a good question. So if your city, so if you are an engineer, a contractor, anybody who does contract work for the city, and what you need to be worried about as an elected official then is taking any action on something that could potentially financially impact you. So let's say your city council is the entity that actually has to authorize a contract, and your engineering firm is who staff has selected. You would have obviously a financial interest in authorizing that contract. So that would be one where you would have an actual conflict of interest and probably need to recuse yourself. What I generally recommend to incoming councilors and mayors who have a private business that regularly does work with the city is have that conversation with your city manager kind of right off the bat. They probably already know it. They may have even flagged it themselves, but just have a conversation so you can start to work with them to identify any issues that may pop up with some actions that you're going to take. But generally speaking, it's really, you're going to want to focus on those conflict of interest issues. What vote or recommendation on the council are you taking that may or will impact you financially in your business affairs?
Okay, we have some questions in the chat as well. First one, if we have an ethics question, who do we talk to?
So I think, as Jamie said in her slide, the best place to always start is the Oregon Government Ethics Commission staff. They're going to be the #1 place to go to get answers for those questions. What I think is useful is that every once in a while, you don't really know how to frame the question that you have, right? So you just got a spidey sense or something's triggering that there might be an issue. When those instances happen, I think asking your city attorney for some guidance on how to help frame the question, issue spot the areas you want to talk to the commission about. You can use Jamie and I for that as well at the league. But the ultimate person you should always rely on is the Oregon Government Ethics Commission staff. They're the people who really get to decide whether or not you have an issue with the ethics statute. And that's always the person you should rely upon the most.
Next question, are campaign donations from developers and landowners who have existing development business in front of the council an ethics violation?
So if you remember correctly, campaign donations aren't part of the gift requirements that you have to worry about. And so you have to ask then the other thing you would ask yourself is there a potential or an actual conflict of interest? And so remember, is your action going to financially benefit or hurt you, or could it potentially financially benefit or hurt you? That's the type of question where I would really encourage you to ask the Ethics Commission about that particular issue, because I could see something arising. So, if you're in the middle of an active campaign season, so let's say this issue happens in October, the election's right around the corner, you've got people funneling in, and it could or could not. I don't think it's going to be an actual conflict of interest, because there's no guarantee that if you vote on something, somebody else is going to give you a campaign contribution. It might be more of a potential, but that's one of those issues where you're going to want to talk with the Ethics Commission and flesh that question out. It's not a gift issue per se. If it's going to be anything, it would probably be a conflict of interest issue.
Would donations made to a nonprofit that an elected official presides over be considered gifts, even if the official does not personally benefit from it?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So if you yourself are not getting the gift, so the gift is to you or your family members. So it's not to so the nonprofit isn't you, if that makes sense. That's just a board that you sit on. That's different. The best example of that I can actually give is probably something more easily understood. So I don't know if it's going to happen this year, but in normal non-COVID years, around this time, businesses, city governments, county governments start getting gift baskets from all these suppliers, right? You get cookies from people who do your road work, you get chocolate, you get popcorn, it's all that great, right? If they were giving that to me, Patty Movahill, so if one of the contractors I regularly work with was trying to give me a big old box of chocolate and candy, and that would be a gift to Patty. But giving it to the League of Oregon Cities is not giving it to a person, so it doesn't subject us to the gift requirements. So if the gift isn't being given to you or your family member, a member of your household, if it's being given to that nonprofit, the gift provision shouldn't apply.
Okay, another question. Should we avoid buying a lunch or coffee for a fellow city council member or city staffer?
So the question you have to ask yourself is does the person have an administrative or legislative interest in you? So let's take the city councilor person. Let's say, you can't see her, but let's say Denise and I both decided we were going to run for office and we sit on the city council, and I decide to buy Denise lunch. I do have a legislative interest in Denise, right? Because I probably want to vote at some point. So me giving her something probably does equal a gift. So I'm going to have to ask myself, is lunch more than $50? Probably not. If it's me and Denise going out to lunch, it's probably not more than $50. So that's probably acceptable. But remember, it's the cumulative every year. So I'm going to have to make sure that I know that, on December 11th, Denise and I went out to lunch and I bought her a $15 lunch. So that if I decide to go out to lunch with her on December 21st, I can add whatever that is so I don't go over the $50 limit. That's the analysis you're going to want to do whenever you are giving or receiving those types of things. I take a very conservative approach. I'm a public official just like you, and some of it is just laziness. I don't want to do the tracking, right? I don't want to have to ask myself over and over again, does this person have a legislative or administrative interest in me? How much is it? Did I already get something from them? So I personally, as a public official, I don't let people buy me lunch. I don't let people buy me beer if we're out. I just take care of that myself. That's my choice. You can make whatever choice is most comfortable to you as long as you fall within those standards. And you ask yourself, does this person have an administrative and legislative interest in me? What is the dollar amount of this? And have I gotten more than that in a year? And can I make sure that I know that at the end of the year, this is what I have gotten from that person? That's up to you. The other thing that Jamie and I always encourage people to think about, and I know I've talked about this already in a couple of the settings, is perceptions do matter. Again, there's the law, what you can legally do, and then there's the perception of your citizens. And so just think about how your citizens perceive things, and if that bothers you, if they see you getting lunch from people or not. You could be doing absolutely nothing wrong and paying for it, but my guess is if you're having coffee with a well-known developer in town and somebody who doesn't like that developer sees you, even if you're buying that coffee yourself, they're going to probably just think what they want to think. You can't control what other people think, you can't control what other people perceive, but it is an issue you should be aware about, particularly if you're newly elected officials.
Next question. If the counselor is the presiding officer for a nonprofit and receives no compensation for that position and no personal benefit, would it be a conflict for the counselor to take part in votes regarding interactions with that nonprofit, for example, city grants?
No, there's a specific exemption for that position if you're in a nonprofit. So that's specifically exempted under the statutes.
Okay. Next question. If I work at a nonprofit and we have lobbyists on retainer, do I need to list the names of the lobbyists on the SEI?
I actually don't know the answer to that question. What I would do is actually call the commission when you get your SEI form and ask. I will tell you, I serve on my city's landmarks commission, so I have to fill out the SEI every year, and I struggle with it. I get too lawyerly and I get in my own head, and so every year I do it. Honestly, I just call them, and they're super kind and super nice, and I just walk through each question with them, and they help me out. I don't know the answer to that one, but that's one where I would say call them and ask, and they'll tell you right away.
This next one pertains to the SEI as well. Does it mean that as a counselor we have to file for an SEI?
You don't have to file for one. So I think, as Jamie said, it's typically your city recorder is going to give the commission, the people who are going to send out the SEIs, your email address, and then they're going to send you an email, like she said, in March that says, hey, it's time to fill out your SEI. There's a link. You just click on the link. It takes you right to where it is, and you need to fill it out. If you don't respond to that one or you don't fill it out, they will eventually start sending you multiple emails. If you miss it and you're somebody who regularly checks your email, it's because you literally were just ignoring the multiple emails you got from the state. So you don't have to ask for anything. It will be sent to you directly to your email account, and then you can just click on the link and get it filed.
Next question, regarding that nonprofit exemption, shouldn't there be a process and grant criteria before we allocate city funds rather than just giving city funds directly to a nonprofit?
So that's a little bit off topic with ethics. So it's that I don't know the answer to that. So generally speaking, cities decide how they want to divvy up any grant allocations or funding sources they have. I would speak with your city manager to see if you have any policies about that, if there's anything in your budget documents or your strategic plan that give you some governing documents. It's not necessarily an ethics issue, more of an internal decision for cities to make.
Okay, and I see a hand raised. Joel, go ahead and unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
I'm the one that's been asking the questions regarding the nonprofit because I am preside over a nonprofit in a small town, and I want to make sure that I don't cross any boundaries. Is there any specifics you would give as a presiding officer in a city councilman that we should make sure that I don't bump up against any lines or anything like that? So.
Yeah, so I think there's two things that I would do. I can sense that you want to make sure that you get this absolutely correct. So if I were you, Joel, I would actually take two steps. The first thing I would do is I would honestly just call the Oregon Government Ethics Commission and lay everything out. And a lot of times if you ask, they're even willing to give you a response in writing. And the reason I would suggest that is because then you could share the guidance you got from them with your counselors and your city manager. And if at any point anybody from the citizenry thought that maybe there wasn't something right about what you were doing, you can show that you preemptively went ahead and made sure that you knew exactly what you had to do and you were following the written advice you got from the Oregon Government Ethics Commission. That would be the very first thing I would do. The second thing I would do is if your city has a city manager, a city administrator, or a city recorder, one of those, I would have a conversation with them and outline again your concerns, share with them what you get from the Oregon Government Ethics Commission, and then follow up and say, are there any internal city policies? Are there city ordinances? Is there anything that you guys want me to do that I'm not already doing or that's not already covered by this? The sooner you have those conversations and can kind of already set the precedent and the process for what you're going to use, I think the better you'll feel going into your time in office, and then everybody's on the same page. But I would really start with the Ethics Commission. They will give you something in writing if you want it, and then everybody knows, not just you. You know, your council knows, and the citizens know that you are following the law and you're going forward with their advice. If I was your city attorney, that's what I would be telling you to work through.
Okay, we do not have any more questions in the chat so far.
Okay, so since we have a little bit of time left in Q&A, Jamie touched on this a lot, and I think she said it several times. I know I've said it here once before. I will stress again. The Oregon Government Ethics Commission is really your friend when it comes to ethics issues, and I always start with this. If I was a new counselor, in fact, I have this today as a public official myself. Jamie gave you a link in the slides to the guide produced by the Oregon Government Ethics Commission. And that guide is going to cover everything that Jamie covered in her presentation. I actually keep it as a desk reference myself. I would encourage each of you to go back and read it. And then I would, if it were me, it would something I'd pull out every 6 to 12 months just to kind of refresh yourself in terms of where am I, what do I need to do. That really is your key, I think, for understanding the Ethics Commission. The second key point when it comes to ethics is the sooner that you can talk to somebody about a potential issue, the better. Whether that's starting with your city manager or your city attorney to figure out if they think you have an issue, or figuring out how to word the question to the commission, the sooner you can get ahead of something, the better. And then the third thing I always say is, and I think maybe Jamie said this as well, is remember that the Ethics Commission rules are really the floor, not the ceiling. And so a few times in my career, I've had counselors who've come to me and who've said, here's the issue that we're gonna vote on. I think I have a conflict of interest, Patty. I cannot be impartial in this situation. And we would walk through the statute, and they didn't have a legal requirement in order basically to recuse themselves. There was no legal conflict of interest for them. And we would talk through the issue of, can they really not be impartial? And what does that mean for the rest of the council? And just because you don't know if you can be impartial or not, there's a lot of city councils out there and a lot of theories out there that you still have an obligation to participate and kind of work really hard to set apart that kind of icky feeling in your stomach if you can, because you were elected to do really hard, really complicated, really controversial things, and that's the expectation. That said, I do know that some cities and some city councils, some city managers and city attorneys have even said, look, if at the end of the day the councilor is saying, I've already made up my mind, I'm not impartial, I do have a bias in this, they'll work with them to try and recuse them, even if it's not at the statutory level where they're legally required to do so. So think about those things when you think about ethics. Make sure you read the Guide to Public Officials and have conversations with your city manager and city attorney as soon as you realize there might be an issue, because it's always easier to avoid a problem than it is to try and undo a problem that was inadvertently created.
If a member of Public Works Management is a high-ranking member of their church and is involved in the hiring process of new Public Works employees where the only applicants are his church members, is there a conflict of interest, or is that a case of nepotism?
So not inherently. So remember, what the state ethics rules is really worried about when they talk about conflicts of interest or nepotism is, so specifically, is it a benefit to you, to your family member? And remember, Jamie had a slide that listed all those family members. It includes people like your in-laws and your stepchildren, but it really is your family member or somebody who lives in your household. So it doesn't include people that you could have close personal relationships with. It doesn't include people who go to church with you. It doesn't include your best friend. It really is limited under the state ethics laws to yourself, your family members, or members of your household. There could be incidences when your city council has its own rules or policies that go further than the state's ethics laws, so you might want to touch base with your city manager to see if any of those are in place. But as far as the state's concerned, they're really worried about you benefiting yourself, doing something that will affect a family member, or doing something that will affect a member of your household, not just close friends or fellow people who attend your church.
Next question. Imagine a sitting council member lost their home in the wildfire and set up a GoFundMe campaign on Facebook collecting $5,000 of varying amounts, some over $50. Was that action an ethics violation? If so, what action may the counselor take to resolve the situation after the fact?
Oh, wow. That's a really case-specific question. I try really hard not to give legal advice, and I'm going to get close to doing that if I answer this question. So let me see if I can provide some help. I think you want to walk through kind of the step process that Jamie outlined. So you're going to want to know the people who gave you donations. So do they have an administrative or legislative interest in you? So let's say, for example, so I'm not a good example. Let's say just somebody who saw your story and felt bad about you and lives in California, and they donated $250. They probably don't have a legislative or administrative interest in you, so that might make it okay. But you're going to want to walk through those questions that Jamie advised you. Who did the gift come from? That would be the first question. Do they have a legislative or administrative interest in your position with the city? And then was it more than $50? If you run through that analysis and you think you might have an issue, what I'm going to suggest that you do is you contact the Oregon Government Ethics Commission and you walk through the process with them and get some guidance from them on what should or should not be done and what repercussions, if any, there are if you make a mistake. I think the fire has put us all in some unique situations. You're not alone in that, but I would do that analysis first, and then I would have a conversation with the Ethics Commission and ask them their thoughts on the issue and what steps, if any, they think you need to take.
Next question. Are conflicts of interest limited to financial gain? For example, I am employed by the State Fish and Wildlife Department, and hypothetically, my city is dealing with a deer issue in city limits. In what ways might that become a conflict of interest?
So as far as the state's concerned, it's really, conflicts of interest are about financial gain or financial loss. It's really limited to that. So it's some type of financial, it's always like to say, are you going to make money or are you going to lose money? If that's not at play, so let's say, for example, it feels like as a council you could be taking a policy position that differs from the position your full-time employer takes. That's not a conflict of interest under the state's ethics laws. That's probably more of an issue for you personally, if that makes sense. It's not something you've got to necessarily worry about from a statutory standpoint. What I always used to do when I was a city attorney, when I would have counselors who would kind of face those types of what I would call, like, I've got a funny feeling in my stomach issue, this just doesn't seem right, or if I do this, I could have some trouble elsewhere, is sit down and have a conversation about that with your city manager or your city attorney, if you have one. Walk through just to make sure there isn't an actual ethical issue at the state level. It doesn't sound like there would be in those types of instances. And then identify if there's any local policies or guidelines that would help you in that situation or give you further guidance. Some cities will allow counselors to kind of recuse themselves from a vote if they think that they're incapable of not being neutral. Or it's going to negatively impact them in some way, even if it's not a state ethics violation. Other councils take the different approach, and that you were elected to make really hard, really difficult, really nasty decisions in public, and when you're forced to do that, that's kind of what you signed up for. But it's really an individual council thing, which is why I suggest you speak with your city manager, or maybe even your city attorney if your manager thinks that you need additional guidance from an attorney.
When we fill out SEI, are we required to disclose income during our time as a candidate and counselor-elect, or only after we are sworn in?
That's a great question. I'm almost positive that you also have to do it as a candidate. I'd have to go back and look. So what I'm going to do in this instance is I'm going to have Julie copy that question and email it to me, and I will email everybody who registered for this session and follow up. I'm about 90% sure it applies to candidates, but I don't have the statute in front of me, and this was technically Jamie's session, so I'm pitch hitting today. But I will follow up with you guys in an email in the next 2 business days just to clarify.
Another question on SEI. As an incoming elected official, when the official files in April of 2021, considering they took office in January of 2021, is the reporting period for calendar year 2020?
I believe so. I will put all of that information in the email about the campaign issue as well that was related to the SEI. So I'll get all of that. I'll get you detailed information out in the next 2 days via email.
Next question. If we call the ethics office to talk about our specific situation, can that information we give to the ethics office be used against us in a later ethics action?
It's possible. So remember what Jamie said is you want to get prospective advice from the Ethics Commission. So it's always better to ask for permission instead of forgiveness. My husband takes the opposite approach. He's going to do something and then ask for forgiveness later. That's not the best course of action when dealing with the Ethics Commission. You want to ask for permission first. The benefit of also being like the most honest. So when I tell people to talk to the Ethics Commission in advance, what I always like to say is, don't pretend like you're on a first date. And by that I mean, when you're on a first date, you eat nice food, you get all dressed up, you present your absolute best foot forward. When you talk with the Ethics Commission, pretend like you've been married for 20 years and let it all hang out. And the reason I say that is if you give them the complete 100% unvarnished truth, walk through every possible issue you might be having, and they give you a detailed response on the steps you need to take, and you follow those steps to the T, and somebody then later files an ethics complaint against you and it's investigated, if you follow the advice of the Ethics Commission, you will be fine. And so it's better to ask them in advance and make sure that you follow the directions. Now, if you don't follow the directions and a complaint comes up, that probably could be used against you in the investigation. What I have generally found is that the Ethics Commission is not interested in punishing people. Their goal is really not to penalize people. It really is educational in nature. So they want you to ask questions as soon as you have them. When they investigate complaints, they're not, again, looking at a gotcha moment. They are really looking, even if they find that there was a violation, they're looking to find out what the root cause of the violation was and to see if they can work with the elected officials so that those violations don't happen again. They're very much an educational agency. That's their goal. They're not trying to kind of slam the proverbial hammer down on anybody.
Is it a conflict for city staff to be involved in approval of projects within the city limits that involve their relative?
So involve is a tricky word. So remember, when it comes to city staff, their role in terms of having a conflict of interest is, are they making a decision, or are they strongly making a recommendation about an issue? And that's going to kind of be the rub for them. What I always tell city managers who call and say, I'm not really sure if this is an issue for my staff, should they be working on it, should they not, is let's walk through it. You know, are they the decision maker? If they're not the decision maker, the next question to really ask yourself is, if they're not a decision maker, but they basically are the person who's making the strong recommendation, we might have an issue. I'll use myself as an example. Because I'm the lawyer for the League of Oregon Cities, when it comes to reviewing a contract, 99% of the time, if I say, look, the contract's is legally sound, there's no real risk to us, we should enter it, I may not be the decision maker as to whether or not we enter into that contract, but 99% of the time, my recommendation is what's taken. So I've got a pretty strong voice in whether or not that decision is in fact made. If that's the issue where your employee is, those are one of the instances where what I would do is I would sit down and have a conversation again with the Ethics Commission and say, look, here's the exact project that's going to be on, here's the authority and the type of recommendation this particular employee is going to be allowed to have, and in making that recommendation, they could be impacting their family member or themselves directly because they own property in that area, and let the Ethics Commission tell you what they could or could not do. What's interesting, remember, is when it comes to staff, you can always give that issue to somebody else to make the decision on. So you're just going to want to figure out how that works. But it's not just enough to remember, say, well, the staff lives there and they're, you know, responsible for putting the CAD drawing together if it's a development issue. If they're not a decision maker or making recommendations, it may not be enough to be an actual ethics issue.
There are no further questions in the chat.
Okay. So before we break for lunch, because I'm sure everybody's just as hungry as I am, Jamie mentioned this at the end of the program, but I do think it's worth hitting on. The Guide for Public Officials that's put out by the Oregon Government Ethics Commission is really something I encourage every elected official to read. It's one of those documents that I think you want to print out. I think you actually want a paper copy of it, and I think you want to read it at least once a year. You don't have to be inherent experts on this, but as Jamie mentioned, you are privately required to comply with the Ethics Commission. So when there's violations, it's not a city violation. It could be a violation that you yourself did. And because of that, I think it's important for you as individuals to understand what you should or should not be doing and any limitations thereon. The guide's not very long. It's super easy to read. It's broken down, conflicts of interest, nepotism, and gifts. And again, when I was a city attorney, those are one of those things that I would ask my counselor to pull out in January and read at least once a year. Just take the 25, 30 minutes to sit down and read it, and then just kind of keep it in all of your city supplies or wherever you keep your city documents so you can refer back to. Jamie and I and Colton, our honors attorney, are here if you ever need help trying to identify if the Ethics Commission needs to be called. We're happy to help you frame the question. We're also happy to do some background research. So if you think you have an issue and you want to know if the commission's ever issued an opinion on it, we're happy to help you with that as well. We will never be the final say-so as to whether or not something is a violation of the rules. That should always be the commission. But we're happy to be the person who helps you identify whether they should be asked. We're happy to help you craft the question that needs to be posed to them. And we are happy to help you find opinions that they've issued in the past if that would be useful to you.
What about a door prize? City pays for banquet ticket for city councilors to attend annual chamber banquet. Typically, tables are sponsored by local business, and there are prizes for each place at the table, often larger than $100. If a counselor wins the table prize, is that a gift?
So you're going to want to run through the steps, okay? You're going to want to ask yourself, what's the limit? We're going to assume here it sounds like it's over $50. You're going to want to see if there is a legislative or administrative interest, and that could depend. So if there's a lot of vendors, if the door prize is from a vendor who potentially has someone who has administrative interest, that looks like that might be an issue. So what happens? What happens if you are in a raffle and you receive a door prize? What do you do with it? So you can always just tell them, no, thank you. I can't receive it per the ethics laws. If one shows up on your doorstep, what do you do with it? Depending on what it is, you could donate it to a potential charity that it might be appropriate for, and just don't take the tax write-off. If it's, say, like around the holidays, you get those nice gift baskets with cookies and candies and goodies. You can always, if you still have a staff room where there are staff still there, you can always just put it in the staff break room and donate it to the city, because the city as an entity can receive gifts and everything with no limit. Patty, you have any other ideas or suggestions that might help with that?
No, I mean, I think we heard an interesting story from a city manager a couple of weeks ago where his police chief was at a national police conference convention, and he won some souped up Harley Davidson, I remember, that was several $100,000 in value, if I remember correctly. And that police chief apparently went round and round with the ethics commission trying to figure out a way to keep it. And ultimately there was no way that he could keep it, and it had to be, as Jamie said, it was donated, it was raffled off to charity so that charity could get it, and he didn't take any tax deductions or write-offs. So unfortunately, there's not a whole lot we can do as city officials in Oregon when it comes to the ethics statutes for those kinds of things.
Yeah. Lisa?
Next question. So what if staff member and council member are related? Can a gift be given as both council member as well as family member, with the cost being set for the various positions?
So you need to make sure that you are considered a relative for the ethics laws. So for example, nieces and nephews and aunts and uncles, that relationship under the ethics laws, as they've been revised over the past about 5 years, are no longer considered relatives. So you want to see if you are even a relative for the purpose of the law. And then also, it's not so much the relationship with the gift giving, it's whether or not the person receiving the gift or the person gifting the gift has an administrative or legislative interest. So let's say you are a counselor and you have your son-in-law is a city staff member. And if your son-in-law gives you a gift and you oversee his position for some way, which you really shouldn't, because under nepotism laws, there should be some sort of barrier between the two of you there, then that's where there might be an issue. So even though you technically can receive gifts from your relatives, if that relative is employed and could have that legislative or administrative interest, I would take the conservative route and not receive that gift from that relative, but you can always call the commission. They probably have been asked that question before, and they probably will be able to get you an answer with no problem.
Okay, we'll go to a live question. April, I see your hand is raised. If you want to unmute your line, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, I have kind of two questions. One would be kind of following up along those lines of receiving gifts. So does that mean that you have friends who are people in your city that you're no longer allowed to exchange gifts then if they're over $50? And then the second question would be in regards, I have a husband and a son who are volunteers on our local fire department. We actually have a fire board, so it's rare that the city has anything to do with the fire department. But if they did, would that be a situation where I would need to recuse myself or not because they are volunteers on the department?
Sure. So the first question, so you have a friend who is also a citizen of your city who wants to get you a birthday present. So that citizen friend probably has a legislative interest in your decisions as a counselor. So unfortunately, most likely, you would not be able to accept gifts over $50 in the cumulative over the calendar year. So I would say just explain that to your friend. They probably would understand. If you routinely get coffees together or lunches together, just pay for your share. And then to your second question about the fire board. So actually, surprisingly, fire boards districts always kind of come up with cities with this. So if your son or husband receives any sort of stipend, so even though they're volunteer, they might receive maybe an equipment stipend or any other financial potential benefit there, you would likely have to recuse yourself from any budgetary discussions that involve the fire district and your son and husband. That would be a great question with specifics to reach out to the commission about, just to clarify when and when not you can or cannot be involved in those matters. Patty, anything to add with that?
No, Jamie's right. The fire district ones have come up a lot. There was one in Eastern Oregon a couple years ago, and it was a stipend issue in the sense that whenever the volunteer firefighters responded to a fire, they got reimbursed kind of mileage, and so that would happen at the end of the year. And while they were reimbursed by the fire board, the cities who kind of were encompassed by the district would regularly give money to the fire board to kind of help offset some of those stipends. And what the Ethics Commission had said in that instance was, look, if ultimately what you know that you're essentially giving money that's going to be used to pay for the salary or the stipend of your relative, you're going to have a conflict of interest. So Jamie's right. When those situations arise, you should just contact the Ethics Commission. And also, if you have a city manager, give them a heads up that this could be a potential issue for you. It's one thing if it's a city fire department and they know that your son is employed as a firefighter. They may not inherently know that your spouse or your son is a volunteer fire department in a district that the city may occasionally give resources to. So you might want to give your city administrator a heads up to pay attention to that potential as well.
Okay, next question. So just to make sure, no GoFundMe for recovery of the city councilor who has been flooded out unless it is less than $50.
Not necessarily. So what's important with that scenario is to know who the donor is. So I know with GoFundMe, for example, you can make anonymous donations, and that's what you want to avoid. So you can receive, you could have someone from completely out of state, and let's say they have absolutely no tie to your role as a city councilor or the mayor, and they're just a generous person and they want to help with the fire or the flooding relief efforts. You could receive, $300 from that person. That's fine. But what's important is knowing who the source of the donation is, so that you can tell, okay, this person has a legislative or administrative interest in my position as a city councilor. I need to make sure I only receive up to $50 from this person. This person over here, I know it's, Joe Smith from Utah, absolutely no administrative or legislative interest. I can receive $300 for them. So you just have to make sure you know who the donation is from.
Okay, so gift-wise, what are the rules if a mayor and city manager are married?
Okay. Well, again, I think I would go back to contacting the commission in that case, because there is that exception that says relatives, you can receive gifts from relatives. But that doesn't really take into consideration if you are employed by that relative. So I would, I think the most conservative route is when in doubt, just avoid it and say, sorry, dear, not this year. But again, call the commission. They might have a different take on it. I don't actually know what they would say about that because it is kind of a tricky area. But they're super helpful. So I know sometimes when you think of, the Ethics Commission, they are able to, I could receive a fine if I violate the laws. But their goal is to educate and to prevent violations from happening. So if you give them a call, send them an email. On one of my slides, I had that information on there. Just ask and say, and that way you'll have a definite answer that you can then rely upon. I don't know, Patty, any other advice on that?
The only other suggestion I would add is when you get the advice from the Ethics Commission, I'd specifically ask them if they could give it to you in writing, even if it's an email. And the reason I say that is because I think perceptions matter from your citizens and maybe fellow counselors or employees. And so what I would hate for you to experience is for the Ethics Commission to say, it's absolutely fine, there's no restrictions, but you're constantly having to re-explain yourself and justify yourself over and over again to say your councils or your citizens. And that might be one of those situations where when you got it in writing, at a minimum, maybe you share it with your fellow counselors and just say, look, I thought this might be a potential issue. It raised a flag for me. I conferred with the Ethics Commission and this is the advice I've given me. It will kind of maybe hopefully shut some of those inappropriate perceptions down so that you don't feel like you're constantly having to justify and explain yourself over and over again.
Okay, next question. Is it still set that the boss can give gifts of over $50 but not receive gifts of over $50 per year from employees of government entities?
Well, Patty and I have
Yes,
actual real-world experience with this. So Patty is my boss. She's my supervisor. And she is very kind and will gift me items throughout the year, and I'm sure total more than $50, and that is completely acceptable because Patty has no legislative or administrative interest in my decisions, as far as financially, right? Of course, she wants me to be a good employee and do my job. However, I am unable to return the favor. So I guess technically I could gift her something up to $50, but Patty doesn't want to report it, so I just don't gift her anything, which sounds really horrible, but you know, a nice greeting card goes a long way.
Yes, it's more than $50.
Okay, Derek, I see your hand is raised. If you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I understand if somebody is out of state, how they wouldn't have a legislative or administrative interest. But can you help me fully understand the donations from somebody that would have a legislative or administrative interest in relation to like the councilor or mayor that was flooded out in the GoFundMe? Is it a total donation limit of $50 or $50 per person that may have a legislative or administrative interest?
Sure. So great question. And so I want to also clarify the out-of-state thing. So potentially someone who lives out of state could have an interest in your position. Okay, it could be someone who wants to gain a contract with the city. Maybe they're a cable company or something. So I want to make that clear that the line is not just because they're out of state. But with the donations, so the rule is $50 per year per person. So they could give you a $25 donation, someone with an interest, and that would be fine. But then if they wanted to donate again, they would then be limited to $25. So it's that total cumulative donation throughout the calendar year. So come January 1st, if they have already donated $50 this year, January 1st, they could donate another $50. Does that clarify your question?
It does, thank
Okay,
you.
yeah.
That's very clear. I find it strange because you could imagine the power of having 500 or 1,000 people making small donations, you know, that I'm not sure that it would ever be used, but it does seem like it could potentially have an impact on influence if wielded in the right manner.
Absolutely. Let's say you have a city of 1,000 people, right? And everybody donated $50. I think that's $50,000. That really can make an impact. But ethically speaking, by the state law, that would be permitted.
And I would guess, so while Jamie and I are both lawyers and we probably love the law, we can both be honest that the law never really is in tune with technology and modernization of things. And GoFundMes are still relatively new, if you're being completely honest. So when we were probably, when the gift statutes and the ethics statutes were being written, those types of things were probably not honestly being contemplated. We weren't writing those at the state level, thinking about, you know, massive donations from multiple people because of disasters or something like that. So we're probably, it wouldn't surprise me if in 5 years there was some tweak or something that was done, but for right now, that is the rule and that's what you can live by.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, next question. As a counselor, your home has been damaged and there was no insurance on it. You are seeking funding to replace your home from outside organizations outside the city that are offering the same resources to the public. Is this allowed?
So again, you want to look at, do any of those companies have an interest in your decision making? Probably not. So there's two. So you're looking at the gift provisions and then the use of office provisions. So as long as there's no legislative or administrative interest, you're probably fine. And since those insurance payouts or whatnot, or those grants are offered to the general public, assuming they are. Now, if it was one of those, this grant is only available to public officials with your city, then that would raise a red flag for me. But again, if it still looks kind of fishy to you or you're still a little hesitant for accepting it, give the commission a call. They'd be more than happy to help with that.
Okay, I am not seeing any more questions.
Okay, if there are some last minute questions being typed in furiously right now, we can give that a minute or two. And while we're waiting, I do want to emphasize, so I think on one of my very first slides, I referenced that the commission has all their prior advice available online. And that can actually be very helpful because a lot of these instances, with maybe some minor exceptions, happen in all cities and with all officials. So whenever I am presented with an ethics question, and I've been presented with them too, I usually go and try to look at the website and see, okay, have they discussed this topic before? Oh, they did. Okay, what did they say? If you have questions about that, feel free to give myself a call, give Patty a call, send us an email, and we can maybe do some of that research for you too, and find out, say, hey, yeah, 2 years ago, they talked about this exact same question. This is what they said. Or, nope, this is something totally new. They've never addressed GoFundMe before. Give them a call. So always just ask when in doubt. With that, anything else, Lisa?
I don't see anything else.
Okay, well, we're gonna have a little bit of a lunch break, and we'll return at, Lisa, remind me what time?
So 1 o'clock public meetings will start.
Perfect, we'll see you then. Thank you.